Where's this part of it? I think you don't have it until you've got your until you've gone live, is it? Do you think?
Yeah, that's what I did. I took it to the next step.
Okay. In that case. Meeting room. The other one's done already. Yeah. Yeah.
I am waiting for a second, but it's me that screen up.
It was there wasn't the projector wasn't working, I think.
Obviously,
Yeah, so it's recording now.
no, I stopped.
No, that means it's recording, but it's just not showing you the feed.
Oh, they'll have an hour.
I'll have an hour blank. What's that?
Oh. Can we leave it on here though? So that we can use this.
What's that we're hearing? Oh, it's the ad of the laptop. It's that. Not sure why we're there.
We can leave here and make it just here.
So there we've got the laptop. We don't have the camera feed. So
Eva, did you want this one back down? Oh, that's where nothing's coming up.
it's broken? Oh.
How do you present on that one? Okay.
Can we just check?
Yeah.
Can I just see the Zoom's working? You don't need to take your lines off now. Just put the Zoom on top. Yeah, it doesn't want to.
Jessie has to fiddle around and do. Maybe we need Jessie here. Yeah.
No. We're recording ourselves. So that means we're recording off here, doesn't it?
Yeah, we have to leave the meeting.
But did we?
No.
We didn't.
Ah, okay. But then if you leave,
When you leave the
yeah.
leave.
But sometimes there is that error.
Back in the habit of that. Okay, we welcome back Councillor Seymour and Foster from their trips away. I hope you had a great time. Briefly talking to Larry, it sounds that was fantastic. Of course, he couldn't resist at least going to at least one surf spot while he was there, even though it's the wrong time of the year for the surf. Anyway, and Pat, I believe you've been out in Africa somewhere. Yeah. Okay, right, apologies. I've got two, Councillor Akahata Brown and McLean. Thank you. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Declarations of interest. Can't imagine there's any there, but we'll leave that open for everyone. No. So on to the minutes. Okay, moved by Councillor Burdett. Any seconder there? Councillor Dowsing. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Now matters arising and action sheet. So on page 13. So you'll see there's a few dates there that are past, some have been completed and they'll drop off the list. Pauline, any updates that you want to bring?
No, they're just basically basically as they're written there. Most of them have been updated as we go through.
Yeah, one of those is coming in October, Bill. I think that was an issue that you raised around stock control. You'd have to put your microphone on, Bill.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, that's a general statement, and thank you for the response. But in terms of what I've been trying to get to the bottom of is how the funding is allocated, because my main concern was the staffing levels there and the appropriate pay levels. That was where I was coming from, given that they're all doing the job of monitoring the State Highway 35, both in the daylight and dark, in terms of stock roaming on the highways.
Yes, that will be discussed, Bill. So we'll leave that until October when it comes before the committee. So anything else from anyone? Robert.
Chairman, I see we're going to arrange a workshop now, I just want an assurance that that's going to happen, because that seems to be one that we keep on putting off, and to me it's quite a critical thing to get sorted.
It's definitely on the agenda. The first one, which we said we did the credit card, we did a paper, and so we put that, and then they said we wanted further information, and so then we said, okay, we will do that as a workshop. So those things still are as planned. Yeah.
Okay, as planned. So we look forward to getting a date in September.
For the chair, it's for the next finance and audit one, which is September, the September meeting. Yeah.
Thank you.
And just quickly commenting about 005, today is a high level look at our risks, and as you see in the next meeting, we'll be delving into that in a little bit more detail.
Mr. Chairman, while we're talking with the action sheet here, I'm just wondering if it's appropriate to mention and ask if we can have an item put onto that sheet, and that is that this committee has, as of this financial year, we have been told that we get involved in getting the funding for the roading sorted out as a workshop group. The financing for the roading.
You mean what was agreed to a number of months ago about, yeah, but isn't that part of all the review we're doing? That can be one of the first ones we look at, but when we actually start doing the workshopping around revenue and financing policies?
Probably October. It will probably be starting after the annual report, starting getting the basis of that at that time.
Okay. So we can just put that on the action sheet then?
That's exactly what I'm requesting.
Okay.
Because it's one of those things that if we leave too late in the piece, it'll be, you know, just something you can't rush at the end of the financial year.
Yep. Councillor Cranston.
No.
Oh, housing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering, it seems to be that we're stretching out these workshops over quite a distance. If you look at our procurement policy workshop, which we've been discussing since I joined council, I think that's in November now. Does it not make more sense to bring some of these dates forward and to do additional meetings, additional workshops, instead of having to rely on our schedule? Because we don't seem to be getting a good bite out of these otherwise. It seems to be stretching out over a long period of time.
Through the chair, it was a timing issue for us, capability of doing the work. So we've just come in from a long-term plan. We had a paper in March, April about the procurement in depth, and then we said there was wanted to have further information later on. So that was trying to work in with what we had for the annual report and that time, and working those both so it was achievable with what we've actually got on. But it was always, had the initial start, the procurement policy began with a paper in the March, April, and then said we'll follow it up with a workshop, and that time was trying to coincide with after the annual report.
Councillor Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would support Councillor Dowsing because we do tend to get slippage on reporting, and I appreciate entirely what Ms. Foreman's just told us. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to keep those kind of things moving along. And it doesn't matter which committee we look at, there is often a delay or a slippage to another 6-weekly period. So I think it is really important that those kind of things, and that we keep up with them, because that actually doesn't even have a date for it, I think, and it's still to come.
Well, it's November.
Oh, it is November, and it says later, if you look at the status, it will commence later in 2018. And not every last person in this organisation can be involved in the writing of the annual report. I mean, there's a million people in here, a large number of people work in this organisation now. So it must be able that some designated positions, and that's a management decision, not ours, I know, but are able to continue to work on some key aspects of accountability, which is what we're responsible for.
Okay, well, I'll ask the CEO because that's really her area.
Yes.
Yeah, through the chair, just reiterating what Pauline said, acknowledge that there has been slippage in some of these workshops that have meant to be scheduled. We have had capacity constraints, as you've been aware, going through the long-term plan, and that has been an intense process. I think this is also about the prioritisation that the committee gives to the areas that it wants to look at, so that we can schedule them in a time that's prompt and addresses the most critical needs. So if procurement was considered more significant than a credit or sensitive policy, then we will, sensitive expenditure policy, then we should be bringing that in front of that particular policy. But it is about scheduling, it is about prioritisation and our capacity to actually deliver as well. So acknowledging that there has been slippages, but would also like that direction from the committee in terms of what are your priorities around those work streams that need to be done first.
Councillor Seymour.
I thank the Chief Executive for her response, but with respect, I don't think it can be that hard to write a credit card policy, because every organisation at a high level has one, and NZ Local Government New Zealand must have some guidance. And so I don't want us to try to do the Chief Executive's job for it, and I think it's been aired, and we can expect the chairman of this committee to continue those discussions and get those reports back to us in a timely way.
Well, I can only be guided by staff and what they say their resources are. And I think as long as we have all this work completed by the end of the year, I'd be happy enough with that. Okay, so any other issues on the action sheet? Before we go into the rest of the agenda, just signalling that Brett Johansson from PricewaterhouseCoopers is coming at 10:15. So There's not a great size of agenda today, which is a little bit different to normal. We're usually pushed for time. We'll, if we are finished items beforehand, we will just have a longer break before Brett comes. And at the end of the meeting, GHL are coming along just to update us on a couple of things.
Can I just ask, Mr. Chairman, have we had that confirmed? Because Air New Zealand's been closed. Auckland Airport's been closed this morning. Is he coming from Auckland or Wellington?
He's coming from Wellington. He was having another person from Tom, but from Auckland, but he can't make it. So it'll just be one.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. We'll go on to the first item, which is just going through 4 to 9. There is nothing there. So I'm moving on to reports of the Chief Executive and staff, page 19.
And this is something with the governance work plan I just wanted to query, and it's just the fact of the community housing or potential community housing transfer. I just wanted to find out what timelines we've got on that, because again, yeah, it's something that's been in the wind, but for a while.
Pauline,
the report first has to come back from GHL, how that actually fits in with their strategic fit and their business case for it. And so we're awaiting from that as the next response or from there. Tracy, the chief exec of that, had said that that's hopefully within her next scope of about 3 or 4 weeks that she gives that, but it may have been delayed with the annual report. I'll just update you with it as it comes.
Okay, on to this policy on or process of third-party roading investment. Any discussion around that, Councillor Thompson?
I have no problem with starting a process for this, but I think it needs to be quite clear that it is on a case-by-case basis, because we will have issues where roading will affect people, and if they if it's going to change the whole dynamics of roading, we have to do it on a case-by-case. But in general, I'm supportive, and I will be happy to move the paper.
Councillor Seymour. Oh, sorry, I've got a mover, Councillor Thompson, second to Councillor Burdett. Councillor Seymour.
Thank you. Yes, we understand, and we've had several entities, if you like, have discussions with us about this paper. But if I just looked at the flowchart on page 23, and I appreciate why the Regional Transport Committee needs to have a role in this, but it does bother me that that will be a significant delaying tactic. And with the greatest respect, the Regional Transport Committee doesn't seem to have a lot of teeth. So if we look at the flow box in the second row, and the report on to ALIC for decision include in our regional land transport plan, and then the next box, it goes to the Regional Transport Committee for decision and approve the variation. I appreciate that we need to meet criteria from NZTA to secure their level of subsidy, but is there any way that we can see that this process gets moving along? Because both of those, well, particularly going to the Regional Transport Committee for approval, it never goes fast, if I'm blunt. Can Mr. Wilson speak to that for us?
Certainly, yeah, that was a concern I had too. So, David, can you comment on that, please?
So, thank you, Chair. The process of going through the Regional Transport Committee is a requirement by NZTA. So it's something that if we want to unlock funding, we have to have an approval to the RLTP for them to release funding as a prerequisite of any funding that goes through. It is a process where if it's been through the papers to hit that meeting and then go through, it shouldn't be a slow process at all. It's hitting the next meeting that it is for the Regional Transport Committee. But unfortunately, NZTA require that for us to give any funding.
Okay, thanks.
Can I supplement you, Mr. Chairman? I figured that that was the process, but is there some way we can have our Regional Transport Committee more effective? Because I think some councillors will be aware we've had to drop 2 councillors off it. It only has 4 councillors on it that have a vote. The public who sit there don't have a vote. And so it's a bit of a toothless warrior, if you ask me. So is there a better way? And I know that some of that is set by legislation on how it should function, but for it to have to go to the Regional Transport Committee, which is actually only 4 votes, it is a bit of a nonsense.
Microphone.
I can't see any issues in terms of regional land transport. From where I am, we merely rubber stamp it.
And how often are the meetings? Through the chair. How often are the meetings? Exactly.
Are they 6 weekly?
No.
Quarterly.
4 a year. It is a nonsense.
So
Okay.
through the chair, the meeting quarterly will not affect most of the works that we're currently doing on the network when we partner with different companies to pay that third party. If it's an amendment to the RLTP, it's because it's something that's not in there. So that's for a big capital upgrade. They don't happen fast. We work with them around what the requirements are going to be, and we normally know months before they're going to start work, before we need to have an approval go through that RTC. So quarterly shouldn't slow down the work or hold anybody up.
Okay, Councillor Cranston.
Yeah, how forward-reaching will the business case be? What I mean by that is, you know, the repairs and maintenance 20 years down the track, will the responsibility be identified there in the agreements, or will they, once they've got their forestry out, will they suddenly decide, well, we don't actually need this road so much anyway, so we'll just let it go? And the other part of that, I realise they're very minimally used road, but public access, you know, we'd have to guarantee that there's going to be no conditions on that because it's to kind of take some ownership of that road in a way. So yeah, so those two things, the business case for repairs and maintenance going forward.
So through the chair, those things have to be agreed prior as part of that business case. Some of the things that have to be approved before we'll even consider it is that the roads to be delivered to our standard, not the forestry standard. For any improvements have to meet the engineering spec, and then also have to be at a level that we're going to be able to maintain them. So most of the things we're talking about here where we get requests are for things like site benching, road widening, new drainage, those things that companies want to pay for. As the committee is well aware, we have a number of roads that have issues at the moment that we can't afford to fix, and forestry is saying, well, we're the ones damaging it, we'll pay for it. To help with that scenario of it. Where it comes to new roads, that'd be something that would have to come back through full council for something to be discussed if we were going to open a new road anywhere, because there's land purchase involved and there's a significant amount of money involved with those. So they would be a full council decision.
And just further to these business cases, how onerous is that going to be? I mean, what level of detail, what resource do these people need to actually bring a adequate business case?
So the business case, sorry, through the chair, the business case process is fit for purpose. So if it's only something small like site benching where it's a small piece of work and there's no hard engineering, it's a very simple thing around that. The business case can be, we have this forest up here, X amount of loads that are stems that can't make it down this road. So it can be a 1-2 pager. If it's a major, then there has to be some engineering spec in and around, and then that cost benefit. A lot of that's driven by NZTA and the requirement to unlock any funds out of there. As the process shows, having an approval doesn't unlock the NZTA money because they still have to weigh it up against other projects that are competing nationally. So to unlock the National Land Transport Fund is a lot harder because they have to try and then get it up against everything else. And they will also be questioning, is this only for the benefit of one landowner? So why would we use taxpayer funding to go into that? So there are hoops that have to be covered off for that NZTA funding.
Okay, thanks for that. Any further questions or comments? I'll put the motion. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Okay. So that paper on risk, just a high level look at that, and as you saw in the action sheet that we will delve into a bit more detail about specific areas that it's really, I guess, understanding our risks around our assets, because that's one of our essential parts of why we're here. And as you'll see later in one of the reports, a statement of comprehensive income and expenses, that there are carryovers, and we are not aware of whether that and I'm sure that it's not causing a risk to our assets, but we have no input because we don't understand the risks and the assets that are to do with that. So, James, have you got anything more to add to this paper?
Thank you. Through the chair. No, not a lot more to add. I just wanted to make some quick observations. So the report bears out the approach that we've got to risk across our asset management activities. I just wanted to also make a point that you may have a question around where are the rest of the assets. So this is the first of 2 reports. You'll have a very similar report coming through for the other asset areas. So just if that wasn't clear, that's the approach that we're taking. So the assets that are covered in this report are largely in the community lifelines area, and the next report will cover our livable community space in terms of community facilities. I think, yeah, and just apologies from Katie who's not able to be here today, so I'm standing in for her. You'll see that the report goes through each of those key areas and make some observations at a very high level around how risk is treated in those areas.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. Any discussion from anyone? Councillor Seymour.
Thank you. Just to clarify for the benefit of everyone reading the paper, a detention dam is? Page 28, item 25.
So through the chair, the detention dams, we have a number of these across the region. They are where spoil's been put, so where something's been excavated, it's been put there, and they normally have quite large volumes of water, mud, and behind them, so they're there to hold things back from hitting down onto a road or to try and keep a piece of hill that's fallen down in one place.
Thank you.
Robert, sorry.
And the other question is the risk partner has completed the strategic risk assessment on page 30, number 43. Can someone just tell me who that is, please?
That's Katie.
Pardon?
Katie.
So it's a council officer?
Yes. Yes.
So why are we calling it a risk partner when it's actually a council officer? Just a matter of clarity.
Yeah, so we use the term partner quite a lot in terms of our officers. So they're partnering from one hub to another. So Katie sits in internal partnerships, but she will act as a risk partner for other areas given her scope.
Thank you.
Robert.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I welcome this new focus on our risks. I would encourage us to see a report at every meeting outlining, say, your perception of what maybe are our 15 or 20 top risks, maybe rate them on a 1 to 10 for the gravity of the effect that they could have on the organisation, just a quick note about how these risks are being mitigated, and just so that we can see that things are under control. Also, something added there as to risks being faced or disasters being faced by other councils around the country. You know, Hawke's Bay would be an example with their water supply, just so that we can see what is being faced in other areas, and would that be a risk to us as well. But certainly welcome this initial work in this area. Thank you.
Through the chair, yeah, thank you for that comment. You'll note that action item 5 and 6 actually talk about our approach to doing the reporting around risk. So this is actually part of that journey. So 22nd of March, you saw the first tranche of those high-level risks coming through to council in our reporting framework. There's another report due in that vein. So this sits as part of that program of work. So in September, you'll see the next lot of sort of asset management area in terms of risk, and you'll see a further report coming through for the other tranche of risk areas that we haven't actually reported up to finance and audit. So it sits as a sort of a wider program of work that Katie's working on across the organisation.
Okay, Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I have concerns about this, and it's something that's concerned me right through the term of my service on council. And I see, I can go to 25 on page 28, and the question you sort of ask yourself is, the main risk of council is related to flooding as a result of poorly maintained assets. Well, poorly maintained assets don't create flooding, you know, and it's either, we've just been given a very big example of a risk from flooding and what it can do. And that was lucky. It was in a very small catchment. It was in a very small area, and it will be manageable. Now, down the bottom of that same 25, these risks are mitigated by routine inspections. Well, routine inspections don't stop flooding, you know, and my concern is that, and it always has been, is that we've depreciated these assets over the years, but that money has been used as a loan to other expenditures, and we don't have a kitty of money, but that's fine so long as we can manage that program of replacement against income from depreciation in future years. But if it happens ahead of schedule, like if there was a Monty Great flood and took out the bridges on the coast, then we have a different situation. So if you also look down the bottom there, it's mitigated by insurance. So, and that's exactly what we've been told, that if that happens, it's mitigated by insurance. And so therefore, if in the event of a flood, so it's not such a big problem, then that's fine. But recently, and that's something I've always thought, okay, I can live with that. The bridge has got a 100-year life. If the flood comes, we have insurance. Recently, after the recent event in up the coast, the question was asked in the press, and I rather than finding out through a statement in a risk mitigation, but it came out in the paper that the bridges were not insured because it cost too much to insure them. So therefore, if we had the equivalent of a cyclone bowler and more, where bridges were taken out all the way up the coast, how many of those bridges are actually insured? And is there cash available now in the program, or how do we get that money ahead of schedule that we've obviously depreciated for replacement? If they need replacing, it needs to be replaced earlier than is, if you can understand what I'm saying, than was prescribed. Therefore, we've got a problem because that money's all been spent on other, lent out. It's been lent out on other things. So I have a serious concern. It's always been a concern of mine in the back of my mind, and it was made more of a concern recently when it was noted in the Gisborne Herald that our bridges were not insured, yet we had been told in the early stages that if there's an issue, we have insurance.
Well, in a general discussion, you would say that's the whole point of starting this risk discussion up. And the first thing you need to know is actually what the risks are and what are the mitigating things around it. And you've mentioned an example there. Yes, insurance is one of them, but upgrading maintaining your assets is another. And it's understanding the assets. And I would suggest that this committee will look at high-level ones, but it may be your committee, if they feel that one area needs more investigation, is that you actually look at more detail into this particular issue that you're talking about. So, yes.
Thank you, through the chair. So, Councillor Thompson, in response to a couple of your questions there, the risk around flooding from poorly maintained assets was one of the very big findings that came out of the Edgecombe reports, and it's something that we're very conscious of. On staff, we have our Land Rivers and Coastal team, and their role is to maintain our flood assets. So a lot of the things that we talk about are quite simple. So it is going out and unblocking culverts, making sure that we don't have too much growth inside the stock banks, making sure that we're cutting out debris, and making sure that we are replacing those assets as they go through. So things like pumps need replacing routinely, making sure that they are actually working. So we have a full-time team that are maintaining our flood assets. When it comes to bridges, you're 100% right. We don't insure all of them, and that's because it's not worth insuring some of them. This council's made decisions around, excuse me, for the value of a bridge and whether or not it's getting it insured for. The premiums for us to insure every bridge across the district completely outweighs the actual cost of cover that we would get. We have our strategic bridges that you've chosen to make sure that they are insured. So they are covered. The ones on the state highway are covered, but the rationale at the time was if we got an event that took out all of the bridges within the district, one, it'd be very unlikely, and we would look at see how we would replace them as they went through. So it's hard to imagine an event that would take out enough bridges to warrant the insurance cover that would need to be there. We have an asset renewal program for bridges in our budgets for Tairāwhiti roads, and we have a renewals program that's going through either strengthening, upgrading, or completely replacing and raising bridges in some areas as well. And the last LTP that you've just approved, we've put significant budget in for our program to make sure that we can do those bridges for the next 10 years as it fits in through there.
David, Councillor Dowsing? Oh, okay. Foster, Councillor Foster.
Yeah, I just have a question on that because at the end of the day, the bridges that are insured, you're totally at the reliant of the insurance companies approving repayment as urgent as possible to get things rolling. And just going on previous incidents around the country with Kaikoura and other weather events or natural disasters, the insurance companies haven't had the best record of keeping up to their end of the agreement, with payments on time and everything. So it does beg the question, if an event did happen and our insured bridges were affected, the timelines of getting money and be able to be in the position to be able to replace them as soon as possible. And how would you fund that if the insurance wasn't on time? So.
Does anyone want to answer that? Because, yeah, I mean, the example of Christchurch where people have been fighting for years. But anyway, have you got any comment on that, Dave?
There is a big difference between, sorry, through the chair, there's a big difference between how we operate with our insurers and the agreements that we have around releasing of emergency funding, whether it be from insurance companies, central government, those things. When it comes to repairs for critical things to get roads open, as you've seen, we just do it. And then we look at it, how we're going to make sure that the works are paid for. So we get roads open, we replace bridges. Long-term fixes like bridges and the ones that are there, we're pretty confident the relationship that we have and the clout that being part of BOPLAS and Local Government New Zealand, we have billions of dollars with these companies, so it's in their best interest to make sure that they're paying as well. Also, we have a very good record of our assets being maintained. It doesn't turn into a fight normally when councils do this.
Councillor Dowsing.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. In the end, this is about risk and mitigating risks, not about trying to avoid all risks. We can only do as much as we can. So taking a sensible approach on insurance is the right thing to do, knowing that as a council, not as a private landowner, we have access to funds at any stage. We can increase our debt cap if we need to. We can do whatever we need to attain funds in an interim solution. We don't have the and taking a sensible approach on what the depreciation timeline of an asset has to be taken. We can't bring everything forward and look at newer asset renewals just because we're concerned about flooding. We need to take a pragmatic approach as to what's affordable and what's achievable in the long term of the council. So assessing risk is a necessity, but being scared of risk and being overly cautious would be a larger problem, because we would just be money hand over fist trying to combat the future, and we don't know what's going to happen. So I think this is a great report, and the approach we're taking currently seems to be well measured. So I'm happy with it so far.
Councillor Stoltz.
I'm happy to move this.
Seconder, Councillor Foster. All in favour say aye. Against, carried. Councillor Seymour.
Yeah, I did want to speak about a couple of elements of it. I mean, we must be doing this, but I just think that there's a few things we could be just a bit more careful or practical about. I mean, under land transport on page 28, it says at 27, the risk practices managed by Tairāwhiti roads could be considered as mature, and they have regular risk workshops. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but we actually know that for the last 6 months of the financial year just completed, there's been a pile of pushback as we endeavoured to pull the budget in and get ourselves into a more suitable financial situation at year end. And I'm not criticising anyone, because I really do want to acknowledge that Tairāwhiti Roads really responded, and the council team really responded after the heavy rainfall events. But if we had kept our culverts and our side drains cleared and continued a slightly better level of maintenance, water tabling, I mean, we wouldn't potentially have had water diverted to the right place instead of some of the places it went into. So it's fine to say we've got a mature risk practice and they hold regular workshops. That's fine, but that is not saying that work gets done in the field. So I just temper my observations in this by drawing attention to that, and also health and safety of staff in the community as a result of access bridge collapse is one of the bullet points. And I just think we need to think about what we're writing, because that would be a health and safety risk, but there'd be a pile of others that would come ahead of that, I would suggest. I mean, when we come to the finance papers later, I've got some comment to make about the things we haven't done, which are impacted on the Wi-Fi flood control.
Or shall we leave it till then?
I will, but I'm just saying they tie into what is deemed to be a response.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to page 31, draft financial report.
Through the chair, I'd just like to make some comments with it, just to give you an introduction to it. We are about 75 to 80% of the process for the annual report process coming through. So it's not a full or final indication of what it is, but it is probably a high level of what's our results at this particular time. And that's to give you an update rather than leaving it later, which is due in October. Just a couple of other things with it. There is a recording of an accounting service surplus, but I just want to reiterate what that accounting surplus means in terms of dollars or real terms. Is mostly an accounting surplus, and it occurs when you have the recording of capital grant revenue, but there is no operational cost to offset that recorded grant income. And so that creates a surplus, but that surplus goes towards reducing your overall debt. And so as we are not rating more than what we need, it is basically just recording that surplus against the position. The other sort of major things within here is trying to tell you the big story of where the drivers are for the position at this particular point in time. Not meant to hide or not say that we're not giving emphasis to, is just to say these are the areas which have given rise to what we're forecasting, and what that is, and we've already said it before, is the capital grant revenue. And when I can explain it probably better if you actually go to page 35 when you're actually looking at it. And if we go down, as you see in the appendix, it's basically got your year-to-date costs on the right-hand side. So it's got your full-year budget, and then it's got your variances. And when you're looking at that, you look at the major variances that occur along the right-hand side. And so on the second one down, first one down, it says there's a $3 million increase in revenue. That's the relationship between the increased revenue from the emergency works. Down from below that is the 7 million, which is saying is a difference in timing issue with the capital revenue. And that explain is most of the difference in the overall final net surplus. But if you go down below in the expenses where you see significant variances, as it was trying to say, the main drivers of the operating expenditure is the $3.6 million worth of emergency works, which occurred over the course of 2017-18. Offsetting that, there is about at the moment in the air, about $500,000 in provision movements. So that equates, if you like, a 4.1 million variance. But because we have savings, and we'll give you the savings or unspent money in a later date when we've got the annual report come through to actually say what are the activities that were reduced. But mostly at this particular point in time, there are in the utilities areas, but there was also a 1 million of special projects which were then put into the long-term plan. So that is the driver of those kind of savings in there. But when we get the full annual report, we'll explain that in detail of what those results are. As I say, it is a high level. We're still doing the process of reviewing, should there be accruals, changing things in and around what it is.
Thank you, Pauline. Councillor Dowsing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have lots of observations on this statement as it stands, but I think you summed it up quite well in your commentary, which is telling us the big story, because it does seem like a bit of a story to me. To be honest, when I look at that front page and the full year variances, and you say let's eliminate the shortfall in capital grants, I look at the unexpected gain in property revaluation and the gains and losses in point of profit of sale of assets, and consider why those aren't the ones you would cross off, because that gives us a much more realistic view of where we are with the finances. The reason we don't receive the capital grants is because we haven't done the work. And when I'll get onto that shortly, but if we eliminate the unexpected property revaluation and the other gains, we actually come up with a variance of minus 6,603,000 for the year. A very different picture. And the property revaluation is obviously not a cash asset, it's only a book value increase, so has no real advantage of being on this sheet. When we move further into the report and we start looking across the board of what hasn't been done, there's a lot of work within the capital projects that hasn't been undertaken. And I'll give you a quick summary. For example, when we look at the carryover, Lawson Field Theatre, 2.719, Pool, 3.947, T Roads have a combined amount of 5.86 million unspent. So those three, that's 12.5 million. Then in stormwater, we've got 1.1 million. In wastewater, we've got 2.955 million. That's another 4.125 million in total just across stormwater and wastewater. That's $16 million of carryover just from those areas. And it's in things like roadside drainage renewals and bridge renewals and all of these things we've been discussing in our risk profile. It's in talking about everything that we should be doing in terms of drain-wise. In terms of the stormwater, we have spent, of our budgeted 1.654, we've only spent 1.654 million. We've only spent $250,000 of that. We have put an additional project in there of 287, but that wasn't a budgeted expense. That was an additional. So when I look through this and I weigh it, and I try to look at it from the variances and the totals, it doesn't make sense. When you see it at a project-based level and you see what hasn't been done, what has been introduced, it starts to tell a very different story. And that story is that we're not achieving what we're saying we're going to do in our budget. And the only reason the variance looks small in the capital works is because we've obviously been able to unlock funding here and there, which has added some projects into the budget. And then we've also had overspends in the areas that we have been achieving. So my concern isn't that we look like we're forecasting a small surplus. My concern is that it looks like we're not doing the work that we're meant to be doing, and that the reality is that our financial position would be much worse if we didn't have that, if we didn't have the property revaluation sitting alongside there to make it look better than it is.
Through the chair, there's quite a few things there, but I'll try and start off with the operational ones. There's certain things, if you're looking on 35, that you actually really got to look at hard, and that is your net surplus deficit before taxation. Well, you also probably after taxation, if you like, because it takes in the dividend. Now, on that, we're saying we're focusing on the 3.9 versus what was in the budget, and we're saying there's a variance of 5.1, most of which we said that the explanation was that for the capital grants, which is the 7 million. Now, the reason why, as you just pointed out, and we focused this last year, exactly the same when we said we had 10 million overspent. We focused on the actual cash costs to council, the majority of that. And that is where our focus needs to be when explaining it. Because you're right, the gains and losses underneath that on property revaluation is just a book value.
Can I challenge that for a second? If we only look at the cash basis and don't look at the outcome, if we don't equate the two, what is the point of looking at the cash basis if there's no work being done for it? If we just give it, you know. We need to allocate that spending against something. It has to have an outcome. So there's no point looking at the cash basis and saying, well, it all balances very nicely and being happy with that, because balancing the books isn't the point. Doing the work is the point.
Through the chair, you're quite right. But what the 10.6 million takes into an accounting revaluation of the 6.9, which is why we wanted to make sure that you focus on the line above that, which said 3.8. That is the total income over expenditure. Now, and the number 9, which says the gains and profit on sale, that is a valuation of mostly of the forestry of the Pamoa. So it was looking at what was the controllable things that we actually had, and what were the variances, and what were the main drivers of those variances. And the main drivers of those costs was predominantly the additional 3.6 million of emergency works which occurred over the course of the year. That was offset by some of the other savings and other expenditure. Again, the full impacts of that will be explained. And then the other things was with regards to recording of the revenue at the top thing. So that was the first thing, is we still saying and giving you the same emphasis from this year to next year. We're not changing the lines where we're giving you the emphasis. We're saying that is where you need to be focusing on that. Of course, there's an overall picture, but taking into account the number 14, which is mostly an accounting surplus, you wouldn't be focusing on, you would be focusing on the line above that. The next part, which I believe is going into the capital works program, which now this here you normally have it summarised by utilities, etc. Now we're trying to give you the same note that would be in the annual report by detail, and it has got most of those variances. And if you were looking at page, so if everybody's looking at the same thing as page 40 to see where the issues, where the differences are, what we said in the annual plan would have a 42 million worth of capital expenditure. At this stage, at the time of producing this, was 30 million actual spend. I believe there's some still counting things come there, but it may be 31 million. So effectively, you're still talking about $11 million variance.
Yeah, look, Councillor Dowsing acknowledges all that. What he's saying is, and I mean, when you look at our comprehensive income and expenses report, well, of course, it doesn't, the bare bones of figures on the table are not the same as performance report. And what you're talking about is performance of the organisation, of looking at what it said it would do and what the result was at the end, and how much it all cost. Did that come up with budget? That's exactly what you're talking about. And so this report isn't that. And what we're trying to do here is trying to extract the bits out of this capital works program and relate it back to that comprehensive income and expenses report. But This is something we have talked about a number of times, because at the end of the day, if we really want to actually have an influence in this organisation and understand what's going on, we need performance reports aligned with the budget. So this doesn't give it as entirely, and here we're trying to extract it all out and talk about it. But anyway, I'll pass on to Councillor Seymour.
Thank you. No, I mean, I just want to support both Councillor Dowsing's and your comments, because this is what I have done, gone through the pages, which are 39 and 40 and 38, and there are a pile of things that we haven't done, that we budgeted to do and that we rated to do. And I'm not going to pick on every single one, but let's pick on one or two. The Pokahu closed landfill. Actually, out of interest, we say we've spent nothing on that, but in actual fact, how can we say that when we've actually had additional testing, because there's some issues there, and because we're needing to follow up on it? So can someone, I don't need to answer today, but can we look at what the answer is for that? Because we are working on Pokahu. There's been meetings with landowners, and there's been additional testing, as I understand, because it gets reported to EPNR. So that was one that I find quite curious. There are a number of things in Tairāwhiti roads, which we've touched on previously. And then under wastewater, the carry forwards, there's four quite substantial figures on page 40. And we rate for these and we say it's important and we're going to do it, and we don't get around to doing it, which is exactly Councillor Dowsing's point. So when we have the conversation you're suggesting we have, Mr. Chairman, we need to understand why that is. And we know in T Roads, some of it was to try to haul back overspends and issues with the contract. And we accepted all that and agreed with council officers when they reported it to us. But, you know, wastewater is something that this council is committed to, and we want a better outcome from it. So it does have to be a concern to us when some of the projects we've identified are going to happen simply don't.
Okay, I'm going to bring Nadine into this. Can you please come up, Nadine?
So through the chair, I just want to point out that, so acknowledge the concerns around the table in terms of the progress made to the capital works. However, over the last 12 months, staff have been bringing back to the committees and outlining the reasons why we would need to carry some work forward. We've had issues with our wet weather, so we haven't been able to get in there and actually do some of the work. We've had issues around actually having enough budget to carry out the roading work, so we've had to slow down in some of the in the areas. In terms of some of the unexplained or the grant funding not achieved, and it was pointed out in terms of the swimming pool, there's $3.9 million there that hasn't been acquired. That's actually the challenge of putting into a plan this expectation around being able to gain $10 million odd in external grant funding. That's not an easy task to achieve, and so it's about being realistic with those major projects as to how we've phased them and realistically when we expect to get the grants. Now in this financial year we're expecting to get some additional grant funding. I think it's to the tune of about 20 odd million for the swimming pool, might be less. But that's realistically, we're going to have to work through a process with the Eastern Community Trust to try and gain that. So it's not likely that we would, you know, it's a high chance that we may not get that type of funding in. That's going to reflect on our books at year end. But so in response to managing those capital projects going forward, through the long-term plan, the staff had done a really good analysis around what can they realistically achieve in that year. We're doing some work around the performance reporting as requested, so you get a good view around how we're tracking to that spend. That's been raised from this committee quite frequently. And the other part of it is it's actually overall, I think that given where we were tracking 12 months ago, this is actually a good outcome for the council by way of actually achieving a surplus when we could have hit another deficit as we did last year. So that's been a concerted effort by staff to actually rein in some of the costs, recognising that there's still some work to do around future capital phasing and management of that. But I think overall, we were, as a staff, very happy that we were managing to get back into black rather than hitting another deficit that was hit to the quantum last year, in spite of also having such a large emergency works to have to try and deliver through the event that we've just had.
Any questions there for Nadine? Robert?
Yes, for Nadine and Pauline, you know, I certainly certainly accept that there is a little bit of confusion with this report in that there are capital operational grants kind of reported in with your normal operational budget. And I would like to see, and one of the other reports that we sometimes do get does give us more clarity on monitoring the operational aspects, but it would be good to get some more clarity on that. But I you know, I think that one thing I'd like to note is that at one stage we were almost 1.5 million variance on the employee expenses, and for the forecast June we've got that down close to 1.3. So, you know, certainly acknowledge that you've been making efforts to pull in those expenses. But just on the explanation for that employee benefit expenses, I've got a question here that the budgets were based on year 3 of the 2015 to 2025 long-term plan. So you're telling me in the budgeting process, you're tied into using budgets from the long-term plan?
The long-term plan, yes, we are. We do have an annual plan which can revise it. But if you're set at a 2% level, there's limited to be able to make the changes. You're constrained by having 2% rates. Secondly, most of the action was taken that the long-term plan was going to be adopted as it was in the long-term plan, as opposed to have wholesale changes for the annual plan. And that's what we did in the last rounds.
Okay, because because as you point out, the nature of the organisation changes. We bring some things in-house, we contract other things, and you know, you can't be expected to be held to a budget that you produced three years ago. You know, it's
no, we do, through the chair, we do the annual plans, but the review that they had wasn't a wholesale go in. It was just what are the major changes with that. Definitely for the process going forward in our annual plan reviews in year 2 and year 3, it will be more comprehensive.
Okay, now again on the employee expenses, I know from experience one thing that really knocks you round is the annual leave accrual. Your staff have been very busy in the last year. We do not get an indication. Perhaps Mr. Beatty could advise us. Are staff taking their annual leave? Because if they don't, we have to recognise that as an employee expense.
These counts take into any liabilities or change of movements with regards to those. It doesn't show you the possible future liabilities of outstanding holidays due for those particular persons. That's recognised in the balance sheet. But that's a separate process that we review as well.
Sorry, just following on from the chair, at an operational level, all directors are managed with looking at the staff that have long-term liability in terms of the annual leave and making sure that they're actively working towards a plan of managing that, so they take time off. Okay, because it's critical that they do, otherwise we end up by wearing a potential liability if they leave or whatever. So yes, that's all for now. I've got another question later on.
Thanks, Robert. Anyone else? I'll move receipt of the report. Second, Councillor Seymour. All in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Okay, moving on to page 41.
Go back.
Okay, an update on the permanent crop remissions. Of course, actually this seems to be causing some echo, but yeah, it was just to have the updated value of the crops and see what effect that had on those particular properties. Councillor Seymour. Okay, I move Councillor Seymour. Councillor Stoltz, anything more? If not, all in favour say aye. Aye, against carried. So we're on page 46 now, sundry debt report.
Through the chair, just a little bit of an error at the bottom of that first page 46. It says, as per the long-term plan 2018-28 rate remissions, it should be reporting the 2015-25 because that's up until the 30th of June 2018. That's the what we're working upon.
Okay. Are you?
Through the chair, no, the first part is talking about sundry invoicing, which is a much smaller pool of debt, and then the other one is talking about the rates.
Okay, I've got a mover from Councillor Seymour, second to Councillor Stoltz. All in favour say aye. Aye, against carried. So we'll break for a morning tea.
What is suggesting that we've got a large amount of additional cost in protecting against our floating rate borrowing coming up?
Yeah, look, I think that I'll jump to slide 13, and that just really just what it's doing is it's showing you what your sensitivity is to changing interest rates. So this chart is taking those debt forecasts per the LTP. And remember in your LTP, your annual borrowing rate was 5%. What we've done in the scenario, we've increased your interest costs by 1%.
Can you tell us what it says under the slide in the box, please? Because this printout is so small, we only get 2 to the page, not 4.
Yeah. Before that happens, can I remind you to use a microphone? We're trying to run a live streaming service here. Yes, we are. So can you please use your microphone when you comment?
I thought this was a workshop. Can we please hear what it says under the, in the box at the bottom of that graph, please? 100% of LTP.
100% of LT borrowing achieved 1% shock higher in interest rates over the LTP period. Thank you.
Yeah. So those debt forecasts you saw earlier stay the same. And what this analysis shows you is you've got your existing debt, you've got your existing interest rate hedges. Over time, of course, they wind down, and there's the assumptions then against what's happening in terms of floating or market interest rates. So what we're saying is we're increasing those by 1% to what's been anticipated in the LTP, and it's showing you that ultimately your interest costs go up to 6%. So just come back to the conversation where you've assumed an average rate of 5%. So the sensitivity of changing interest rates is very real, given the debt forecast you've got, because you've got a greater proportion of your debt, which is going to be repriced against market interest rates. Okay? Yep. So I'll dance back to the previous slide, so slide 12. And this is again looking at a changing scenario, but the changing scenario here is not interest rates, it's your debt forecasts. So that red line is saying 100% of LTP borrowing achieved. So the debt forecast, you draw down your debt as you're anticipating. You can see your borrowing costs go down from 4.5 down to 4% and then slowly move up to 4.6%. So you've got a nice buffer in your LTP. But you can see that if your debt forecast change, so if you only do 70% of your debt forecast, you can see that your borrowing costs go as low as 4.25%. And then they sort of go across the page, then head up towards that 4.6% mark. So again, the sensitivities are there in terms of whether it be your debt scenario is not being unfolding as anticipated, or you've got interest rate risk that's repricing at market rates. Okay. So it's showing us there is a cost if you don't perform to the debt level that you said you were going to do. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the message is the importance of timely and accurate debt forecast, and this interrelationship with the asset managers and engineers. So, so decisions can be made around how this risk is best managed, because again, you don't want to get yourself into a straitjacket. We've been there before, where you go and do a whole lot of hedging and the debt doesn't eventuate, and then you are spending all your time, you've lost that flexibility and that agility that you want, you see. So that's what we call the art and the science coming together, do you know? But a lot of it comes down to communication. So I say Treasury and finance need to be well connected in terms of those conversations. So the Treasury decisions that we make, remember the Treasury decisions are medium to long term. So certainly we will make sure that the
We prefer more frequent, smaller Treasury decisions so we can deal with change, not big one-off decisions. Okay, we don't take punts, but nevertheless, there is risk that needs to be managed. So it's finding the right balance between the two. Okay.
So is that the annual discussion?
Microphone, please.
When you just said that, you know, we need to regularly check in and make small decisions as we go, are you talking about an annual discussion or a 6-monthly discussion or a quarterly discussion?
It's actually monthly.
Monthly. Thank you.
So a lot of our Treasury conversations are very much around stuff like debt forecasts, how they're unfolding. Yeah.
What difficulty is caused by the timing delays in our output of our finances? So it takes some time to get out the council finances, as we see in our agendas, that we're usually several months behind in up-to-date information. How does that leave Treasury or position Treasury in achieving their goals?
Through the chair, the actual Treasury function is based on the day's value of cash and what we say is going to be forecasted. So that is actually monitored on at a daily basis, how much cash you actually need, what is the long-term impacts, but it's overlaying that is the forecasting, what is going to be spent in that particular period, what do we need, and some of that is captured simply by the accounts payable, what's due, and so that's overlaid into a longer 6 months, what are we actually doing. So from our point of view, we manage that on a day-to-day basis of actually what are our needs.
Just a question, what is the level of cooperation between all of the other local bodies and in terms of managing debt almost on a national basis?
Is this a question related to the local government funding agency?
Yeah, I guess so. I just think, you know, with all the councils pulling together, you know, the finance costs could be reduced and premiums that you might be paying on fixing interest rates rather than trying to do it on our own.
Yep. So the local government funding agency was commenced in 2012, and it's owned by the sector, and it's a consolidated funding vehicle for the sector. So to date, it's raised about 8 billion for the sector, and council is getting the benefit of that, those low borrowing rates now and has been since council became a member. And the other piece to that is the sector can borrow for a lot longer term. So it can borrow out to 2033, which is 15 years. So yes, so that action has taken, and this is it's a highly credit rated vehicle, been very successful, I would say, in terms of achieving lower rates. Yeah.
Not all councils are funded.
There's about 60 that are members. Certainly Dunedin City Council and Invercargill City Council aren't, but most of the major borrowing councils are.
Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With regard, we're talking about hedging and security around hedging, and you've got a pretty impressive CV up there before with all the people you deal with, because you wouldn't really want to take our track record of hedging. It's been a bit of a costly exercise. But over all of the bodies that if you were to do an exercise and work out how much they could have got of interest for at the bottom end and how much hedging has cost them, if you understand what I mean, what would have been the outcome? Like, I was once told that the people who sell hedging are way smarter than the people who buy it, and you use it if you have an issue where you would be in dire straits if you didn't, and because, like, with regard to your liquidity of your business, if the banks so you've got you on a lending limit and things went a bit awry where you couldn't borrow a little bit more, but in general, concern is that hedging generally costs more. So with regard to the big picture of all the people you, in general, do you think that hedging has been, has saved money?
I think the sector hasn't really had a choice. They have to have, the sector generally has a requirement to have some fixed rate debt, right? So the only way you could get fixed rate debt and not do, you'd have to use options, interest rate options, and that's like insurance. So you'd have to be paying some premium to be able to get that protection. So we haven't done that sort of analysis, but yeah, look, in hindsight's great. You know, back up to 2008 when we had interest rates at 9%, you'd be saying, great, we've got the hedging. So again, I think the message would be there's a requirement from a prudence perspective to have some fixed rate debt. How much of that fixed rate debt do you have and what instrument do you use is probably the question. Yeah.
Everyone thinks it's a bad idea when interest rates are stable, but it's a good idea when they go berserk.
And that's the worth of a policy, because absolutely people, when you've got benign financial markets, people say, I don't have a risk, but that can change immediately. And you saw that back in 2008. So that's what we're managing ourselves against.
And if you're working from the bottom, it's probably wiser if you're working from higher, you know.
Yeah, I think that's, look, your debt levels are going up. It's better to have interest rates where they are today relative to where they were back in 2008 in terms of the cost of borrowing. Okay. So moving on to other considerations, just to bring this into the conversation. Remember, there's a part of your, I presume, approved financial strategy of proposed debt caps. So just be aware that it's an absolute dollar amount of 85 million, and that's external debt, I presume, Pauline. Yep. Yes, your total, yes, existing plus new.
Yes,
yep.
But it includes our whole company.
No, it's all just councils. And then that steps up to 105 million 4 years on. So you can see the green bars there against the dark bars as your sort of planned debt. So sort of pushing up to the top of it anyway.
Then, Mr. Chairman, if we go out to the last three bars, why are we leaving the cap at that rate if it's projected that we're not going to be using that kind of money? Because that's what we've just been talking about. It costs us to have that much debt. So if the projection is that we're not going to need it at that point, why didn't we shrink it back? Because, I mean, we understand why we ultimately, though not everyone agreed, voted to have 105 mil as our cap. It doesn't look like we're going to use it. And if our track record never does use the maximum debt that we propose, so why weren't we smart enough to say for 3 years we might need 105, but we'll pull it back?
With the chair, we've got another LTP. We adjust those limits at that time, but what we actually manage through the Treasury policy is the green line.
Exactly.
So we wouldn't, it won't affect us any cost in the way that we plan those sort of things, but the cap could be revised at the next LTP, saying in those latter years we have a step down or whatever approach it's.
So supplementary, then why wasn't that recommended at the time we discussed having to push the cap to 105?
Mostly just for simplicity's sake. It was that you had to reach 85 in the first 3 years, and then a second bar was 105.
It would look better in the eyes of the ratepayers if it had been a limited period, and we all know why that is, that we put it up to 105.
Can we move on?
Well, we're all entitled to ask a question, Mr. Chairman.
Yep. Okay. And the other consideration is borrowing costs. So as mentioned earlier, we've assumed 5% the LTP. You've got an interest cover or borrowing cost to revenue measure as well. So you've got sort of flexibility within that buffer to cope with changing interest rates. So you've internally got some management mechanisms around the outlook for future interest rates. But nevertheless, you still want to be proactively managing those risks. Okay, so let's, we've sort of looked at the risks that council have. So it's around cost of borrowing and ongoing access to long-term debt funding. So what's been happening externally with the financial markets? In the first chart, we're going to look at the wholesale interest rate market, then we'll look at the cash markets or the credit markets. So you can see that OCR, that official cash rate, or the 90-day bank bill rates come down from those high levels back in 2008 and sort of gone across the page and sitting at around 2% today. And remember, when we look at the OCR, look at our Reserve Bank in New Zealand, what's the outlook for inflation and growth in New Zealand? And really the markets aren't expecting an OCR increase until November 2019. So our Reserve Bank very much happy to sit on their hands. Inflation at the moment is 1.5%, but we're in an environment where the New Zealand dollar has weakened, commodity prices, particularly oil, have increased, and wages are starting to increase as well. So the markets and the Reserve Bank are anticipating inflation in New Zealand moving from 1.5 back to that 2% target over the next 18 months. So what does that mean? Low interest rates, yes, as a prudent financial manager, to have access to those lower rates is positive, and in your current risk position, you have got exposure to floating, which is bringing down your overall borrowing costs. But again, we need to be thinking medium, long term, given our intergenerational requirements and requirements around the LTP. So when we look at long-term interest rates in New Zealand, we look at the US. Okay, what's happening in the US, and they drive New Zealand's interest rates, long-term interest rates, which is where we generally would be managing our risk. We're not managing our interest rate risk for the next 90-day period. We're generally managing our risk over the next 10 years. So that black line is US government bond yields, 10-year government bond yields. And over the top of that, the orange line is New Zealand government bond yields and interest rate swap rates, which is the rate that council will be transacting their long-term interest rate risk management at. So the US economy is growing at over 4% at the moment. Core inflation's at 2%. Their central bank is wanting to manage the inflation risks around the economy. So their overnight rate at the moment is in a range 1.75 to 2%. They're expected to increase interest rates. And so if they do increase their interest rates as expected, their overnight interest rate will be 3.5% at the end of next year. Ours is closer to 1.75. Okay. So actually the Federal Reserve was out this morning, and their comment was expectation that they will be increasing their interest rates again in April. So you've got a growing US economy with inflation, and generally US would go first, and the rest of the world eventually will follow.
Ask a question with regard to that. There's a lot of prediction about our dollar and exchange rate is heading south, and would it be worth us considering, if we've got large projects with big imported items, that high value imported items, that we look at probably pre-purchasing those, because would the dollar concern you to that extent?
I think it's a good discipline if you're doing big contracts and there's an FX element to it, that we do understand how that's being priced in New Zealand dollars. So it may well be that you can effectively manage that risk independently of that contractor at a more competitive rate. I suppose in terms of our guidance and risk management advice to exporters at the moment, they would be building up their hedging, and importers are generally using up their hedging that they hedged at 73, 74, give US cents. So that's generally where we're sitting at the moment. Our importers aren't really actively increasing their hedge percentages. Yeah. Okay, so interesting observation there, isn't it, in terms of the New Zealand government bond yield? Normally there's a big gap between what New Zealand will pay for offshore capital relative to the US. We would expect that gap over time to open it again, influencing long-term interest rates in New Zealand as being higher, not materially lower than levels seen today. And we talk about the local government funding agency. Good chart here in terms of a lot of councils' long-term borrowing is through the LGFA. You know, the local government funding agencies, those are the margins that they achieve when they go out and issue bonds. And you can see there's still volatility in the margins that they achieve, no fault of their own, just what's been happening with the market. And you can see a general trend where those longer term margins, those 7-year and 10-year margins are moving higher, and the 3 and 5 year margins are moving across the page. But our outlook would be, again, those credit margins are biased across the page and higher, although the LGFA, the increase in those long-term margins is probably going to be moderate, okay, rather than a sharp increase, unless there's a real shock. But it's very hard to predict when those are going to happen. That's why you have a policy to manage yourself against them. So that's what's happening in the market. So inflation sort of building up globally. Eventually will arrive in New Zealand. The question is when. We've been waiting for a while for that to happen, and the Reserve Bank to respond. US interest rates, long-term rates have moved higher. Probably hasn't fed through into New Zealand long rates to the extent it would have in the past for various reasons, but the trend is generally across the page and higher again. So just something to note and reflect on when we look at the strategies for the council. So now we're sort of looking at council-specific risk position, and I've got a visual chart there, series of Manhattans. But this is council's current debt position. So you can see external debt at the moment is 47.9 million. And this is the risk profile that we look at when we have our monthly Treasury meetings. So we want to agree the current position. You can see that 47% of your debt matures in 3 years plus. Okay, so you've only got 5 million that's maturing in the next 12 months. Okay, so you're not exposed to any big shocks in the underlying credit markets or cash markets, other than the fact that you've got this new borrowing. So your existing borrowing is well managed in terms of you've got a good spread of maturities, and you're managing your liquidity position with your committed bank facilities from ANZ and Westpac. Okay. So the question is where to from here? And we've got 5 million that's maturing with the LGFA in March next year. Our advice is to pre-fund that, to do it now. Okay. So what you're doing essentially is you're going out and you're borrowing $5 million, and the recommendation is April 2026, because we're reflecting on your existing debt. Core debt is intergenerational, so you're going to continue to want to use that to fund your sort of like your long-term assets within your balance sheet. Then you've got the new debt you've got to deal with as well, which is a bit more uncertainty around that. So for the intergeneration debt that we know of, we're suggesting that, yeah, you pre-fund that and manage that pricing risk out in March 19. The other piece to the strategy is you've got 15 million of new debt funding in the next year. About right, Pauline? And that's all new debt, I suppose, various degrees of certainty. Okay. So that's the importance of our monthly updates of our debt forecast, cash flow forecast, our monthly meetings, those ongoing discussions with finance and the asset managers to really work out the balance of probabilities of that 15 million of new debt that's required over the next 12 months. Okay. Typically what we would do is we would borrow that debt on a short-term basis. We talk about commercial paper. And then when we know it's core debt, we would roll it out into long-term bonds. So we'd be targeting bonds that are maturing greater than 5 years out. So you've got that continued lengthening of your debt funding maturity profile. Okay. And there's a chart here in terms of, if we do that pre-funding for that March 19, what does it look like? There's a negative Manhattan there, which is offsetting that upcoming maturity in March next year. And you can see there's a new Manhattan out there in the 5-year plus. So you've now got 54% of your debt with a maturity date of greater than 3 years. So you continue that to maintain that term structure of your debt portfolio and spread and smooth it. So that's important, that we don't have a concentration of risk, whether it be funding risk or interest rate risk. Council won't be impacted by an external shock, for instance, and particularly because we've got this new debt coming on board. Is there any questions around the debt funding approach and strategy? Okay. And so this is the other part of your borrowing costs. This is your wholesale interest rate risk. Remember, this is, we talked about the OCR and what the Reserve Bank is doing around inflation and growth in New Zealand. So you can see that's that maturing interest rate swap hedge profile. So it's slowly maturing over time. Basically, based on 43.1 million of 12-month debt forecast, we've got 68% of that is protected with interest rate instruments. 54% of them are maturing in the 5-year plus time band. So again, the weighted average term is quite long, which is consistent with your longer term focus on treasury management. So this is, there's a bit of commentary here, but we want to manage the existing swap portfolio because the assumption being that the current amount of debt will be there for the longer term. And so we'll be using the forward start swap, which we've used in the past to sort of forward manage that interest rate risk. And with interest rates being low relative to history and the bias being higher, we would be targeting rates around current levels to do that ongoing risk management. Okay. We can see that the risk rate percentage falls very quickly when the debt accelerates. So there will be a requirement to sort of manage debt to protect the minimum policy requirement at the very least. Okay. So we would be, again, reflecting on the updated debt forecast. We have our meetings, we'll be haircutting, what I call haircutting those debt forecasts, so we don't get ourselves into an overhedged and uncomfortable position. So that's going to be, it's quite a bit more iterative, I suppose, but it's going to be very much done in conjunction with Pauline and PJ and the team around that. But there's a constant looking forward. What is our risk? What's coming up? We know what our sensitivity is and exposure is to higher interest rates. We need to sort of forward manage this risk. Okay. So that's where our probably main focus of attention is going to be around treasury management. Summing up, I'm happy to take questions as well. Look, just when we talk about treasury, we do reflect back on the statutory objectives and the intergenerational expectations of council, and those careful, well-judged decisions. Now remember that what's going to happen will be what's happening externally to council in terms of the financial markets. Things will change, but manage as best we can what's happening internally with council, particularly the conversation around capital projects and debt forecasts. So we bring that into our discussion around liquidity management, debt funding management, and the interest rate risk management. But that third point there is very much comes back to the capital spend information in the forecasts, which is so important. And then flexibility is probably what I would leave you with. And really asking the question, what can change? What's the probability of it changing? What's the impact of that change? We need to sculpture our funding and interest rate risk management decisions around that. And that's one of the key outputs and actions from the monthly Treasury meetings. So happy to take questions.
So, Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Cranston?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a little bit outside the scope of this, but it'd be something you'd be targeted to answer. Our depreciation, there's certain assets that crop up from time to time that we think, well, that's something we wouldn't replace. What's the procedure to get them so that we don't have to depreciate them? And probably the thing that I'm most focusing on is our community housing, which is a considerable asset. In the private sector, you don't have to depreciate them, but we're paying $300,000 to $400,000 depreciation on the year, and they could look quite considerably more profitable if we didn't depreciate them. So do we have to depreciate them, and why would we?
That's a different question from the Treasury, in that we're talking about what is our managing for what we need for our cash flow, and that's a function mostly of the Treasury. This is looking at what should we be rating for in terms of our needs and recognising the depreciation expense. So in the housing module itself, if you are recognising that activity is a certain expense is depreciation, it's taken into its overall activity of what it actually needs to make in a form of surplus. So you have your revenue, and then the depreciation is an expense, which reduces its overall surplus. So that's a different discussion, and a discussion about what you fund, what you raise in the forms of rates or whatever activities is the depreciation schedule is what we fund or what we don't. And a lot of the things, when you make those decisions about funding depreciation, raising rates for it, is the question. One of them is, are we going to replace these assets? Second one, are we receiving any external revenue that helps supplement the cost of buying these assets? And we know that, like external costs from NZTA, we assume that we'll always have that external funding. So we say we're not going to fund that portion of depreciation for those particular assets. So that's a different discussion, as opposed to that's not going to impact on our ability or what we need to raise for cash, but it's on the function of what are we replacing our assets in future values.
It was out of the scope of this paper, but I know he's spoken on depreciation before, so I thought he might be able to give us some advice on that.
Could we have an answer, please? Because it's just a hypothetical question. It's a totally valid question, and we have an advisor here. Could we have an answer?
Well, if he's prepared to answer it, I mean, it's out of the scope of this question. Have you got a comment on that, Brett?
I think the question was why depreciate affordable housing?
Community housing in the housing in the private sector, you don't have to depreciate. At the moment, we're paying depreciation on a significant community housing portfolio, $300,000 to $400,000 a year. we could probably have a discussion around the table saying, well, would we get into more community housing? Would we do it? And possibly the answer would be not. So if it's something we're not going to replace, why would we spend all this money on going to depreciate it year on year when that money could be better spent and the community housing would be more profitable because of it, because it's actually an appreciating asset.
Yeah, I have to say that is beyond the scope of what I can talk about today, but it's very much focused on your sort of revenue and financing policies, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman. We also have Gisborne Holding Limited, wholly owned subsidiary, who potentially may be raising quite a lot of debt against their asset base. I'm just wondering if you see an advantage in terms of managing the total debt portfolio rather than just council owned debt.
Yes, I think this has been a discussion that council investigated, was it a year or so ago, in terms of the most effective way to fund holdings. Yeah, and if my memory serves me correctly, there was the decision was that you wanted the separation of the holding company from council. My memory serves me correctly for the various reasons. But yes, there is scope in terms of how you fund those types of vehicles and activities.
Okay, thanks, Brett. Look, any other questions around Treasury? No? Okay. We'll go, thanks very much, Brett, for coming along. It was a good presentation. I think we're well aware and comforted that there is a good process in place for managing our funds. So thank you for attending. And now councillors will go to page 53, the Treasury report. There's nothing in there that we probably haven't really covered to a certain degree. Is somebody prepared to move? Councillor Dowsing and Councillor Burdett. All in favour of receiving the report, say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Thank you. Okay, so that's the end part of our open committee, and I see we've got GHL members here, and unfortunately I'm going to have to just ask you to just step out the door just for a moment, just 2 minutes, because we're just dealing with the public excluded section, which is not controversial, but will only take 2 minutes. Okay. Sorry? Yeah, I know. So, but there was the reason why is. Sorry. I'm now moving into. I'll move that we move into public excluded.